Philadelphia, November 1990. A man is dying in a city he has called home for 85 years. He is 93 years old. His throat is being consumed by cancer, and soon the voice that spent 6 decades lecturing in university halls will fall silent forever. But let me tell you something about this man before the silence takes him. In his study, and he still has a study even now, there are stacks of books bearing his name. Not 5, not 10, 30 books, 250 published papers, a lifetime of work so vast that no single scholar alive today has read all of it. And scattered among those books, referenced in nearly every one, are photographs and drawings of clay tablets. Thousands of them. Tablets pulled from the dirt of southern Iraq, shipped across oceans in wooden crates, and deposited in the basement of a museum less than 2 miles from where he now sits. These tablets are between 4,000 and 5,000 years old. They are written in a language that, when this man began his career, fewer than a dozen living human beings could read. The language is Sumerian. The civilization that produced it, Sumer, is considered by mainstream scholarship to be the oldest civilization in recorded human history. And this man, Samuel Noah Kramer, did more to translate, catalogue and interpret those tablets than any other human being who ever lived. He didn't just study Sumer, he is the reason we know what Sumer was. Before Kramer, Sumerian literature barely existed as an academic field. He built it. Fragment by fragment, tablet by tablet, museum by museum, he pulled an entire civilization's written record out of the clay and into the modern world. And at the end of that life, after 70 years of reading the oldest words ever written by human hands, his translations had revealed something that sits uncomfortably with the modern world. Not a theory, not a guess. Something the tablets themselves say plainly. Something that, if taken at face value, would force the entire academic world to rethink the origin story it has told itself about human civilization. So let this story carry you now. Close your eyes if you like. You do not need a screen for this. You only need to listen. His translations made it visible. He published it. He repeated it in book after book, lecture after lecture, until his voice gave out, and the academic world for the most part classified it as mythology, and moved on. This is what Samuel Noah Kramer found. This is what the oldest written records on Earth actually say, and this is why, more than 3 decades after his death, it still matters more than most people realise. To understand why Kramer's conclusions carry such weight, you first have to understand who he was. Because this is not a fringe figure. This is not a self-published author working from a garage. This is the single most credentialed Sumerian scholar of the 20th century, and quite possibly of any century. Samuel Noah Kramer was born on September 28, 1897, in a small town called Zhashkov, in what is now central Ukraine. At the time, it was part of the Russian Empire. His family was Jewish. His father ran a Hebrew school. The boy was given 2 names at birth, Simcha, meaning joy, and Noah, after the biblical patriarch. This second name would prove, in hindsight, almost absurdly fitting, given that Kramer would spend much of his career translating the oldest known flood narrative in human history. In 1905, when Kramer was 8 years old, his family fled the pogroms, organised massacres of Jewish communities carried out under the reign of Tsar Nicholas II. They crossed the Atlantic and settled in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and that city would become the centre of Kramer's life. He was educated there, he worked there, he died there. Philadelphia is where the University of Pennsylvania is located, and the University of Pennsylvania houses one of the largest collections of Sumerian cuneiform tablets on Earth, nearly 30,000 of them, most excavated from the ancient city of Nippur. But Kramer did not come to Sumerology directly. He was, by his own account, a late bloomer. After graduating from South Philadelphia High School, he earned a bachelor's degree in education from Temple University in 1921, but he was restless. He tried writing fiction. He considered a career in business. Nothing stuck. He was approaching 30 years old without a clear direction. Then, as he would later write in his autobiography, titled fittingly, In the World of Sumer, something shifted. He returned to the ancient languages of his childhood, the Hebrew and Aramaic of his father's school, and began to wonder if there was an academic future in that foundation. He enrolled at Dropsy College for Hebrew and cognate learning, also in Philadelphia, and became fascinated with Egyptology. But a disagreement with his Egyptology professor sent him in a different direction, toward the University of Pennsylvania and the study of Mesopotamian languages. It was there, under the guidance of the brilliant young scholar Ephraim Avigdor Speiser, that Kramer discovered cuneiform. And cuneiform changed everything. Let us pause here and talk about what cuneiform actually is, because without understanding the medium you cannot fully grasp what Kramer spent his life doing. Imagine holding a lump of river clay in your hand. It is cool, it is damp, it carries the faint mineral smell of the Euphrates. Now imagine pressing the sharpened end of a reed, cut at an angle, the way a scribe's teacher showed him, into that clay. The impression it leaves is small, wedge-shaped, precise, a single mark. One of hundreds you will press into this tablet before the sun dries it, or the kiln hardens it into something nearly indestructible. That is cuneiform, one of the oldest known writing systems in the world, developed in southern Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, around 3,400 years before the Common Era. That is roughly 5,400 years ago. The word cuneiform itself comes from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. And here is the extraordinary part. Clay survives. It survives fire. It survives flood. It survives burial. It survives, in some cases, 5 millennia of neglect. Where papyrus crumbles and parchment rots, clay endures. The written records of Sumer, administrative documents, legal codes, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations, religious hymns, epic poetry, school exercises, love letters, these have all come down to us, intact or in fragments, pressed into small rectangles of baked earth. The cuneiform script was not used for just one language. Over its 3,000-year lifespan, it was adapted to write Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Hittite, Elamite, and several others. The language Kramer devoted his life to, Sumerian, is the oldest of these and in many ways the most mysterious. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no known relatives. It is not related to the Semitic languages of the region, like Akkadian or Hebrew. It is not Indo-European. It is not Turkic or Dravidian or Uralic. It stands entirely alone in the linguistic record. The people who spoke it, the Sumerians, seem to have appeared in southern Mesopotamia around 5,000 years before the Common Era, and within a remarkably short period of time, they had produced the first known writing system, the first known legal codes, the first known schools, the first known mathematical systems based on a sexagesimal, or base 60, number system that we still use today in our measurement of time and angles. Remember that. Because the question of where the Sumerians came from and how they accomplished what they accomplished is the question that Kramer spent his life trying to answer. Kramer earned his doctorate from the University of Pennsylvania in 1929. But it was in 1930 that his career took its decisive turn. He joined an archaeological expedition to Iraq, excavating at sites including Tel Bila, Tepe Gara, and the ancient city of Farah, the site traditionally identified as the Sumerian city of Shuruppak, the hometown of the flood hero. Standing in the dust of southern Iraq, handling clay tablets that had not been touched by human hands in 4,000 years, Kramer found his calling. These were not abstract academic objects. They were records, real records, left by real people, describing real events, real laws, real beliefs. From 1932 to 1942, Kramer worked at the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, where he specialized in the Sumerian language. One of his earliest major publications, completed in 1940, was the Lamentation over the Destruction of Ur, a long Sumerian poem that he assembled from 22 different tablet fragments scattered across multiple collections. The poem, composed around 2,000 years before the Common Era, bewails the fall of the great city of Ur to the Elamites, describing the devastation in language so vivid and so raw that it reads like an eyewitness account. The people groan, the text repeats, again and again, in a cadence that even 4,000 years later strikes the heart. The goddess Ningal weeps before the divine assembly, pleading for her city to be spared, and is denied. The dogs of Ur no longer sniff at the base of the city wall. The streets are overgrown with weeds. It is, by any literary standard, one of the most powerful lament poems in the history of human writing. And Kramer pieced it together from fragments. That was his gift, the patience and the vision to recognize that a broken tablet in Philadelphia and a broken tablet in Istanbul were once the same text, and to bring them back together across continents and centuries. In 1937 and 38, he travelled to Istanbul to copy Sumerian literary tablets that had been excavated from Nippur decades earlier but shipped to the Ottoman Museum under the terms of archaeological agreements. He returned to Istanbul in 1946 and again in 1951. He would later note with a wry sense of irony that the same Sumerian tablets were sometimes scattered across 3 or 4 different museums on 3 different continents, and that reconstructing a single text often meant physically travelling from Philadelphia to Istanbul to London to Berlin, comparing fragments in each location. In 1942, Kramer joined the University of Pennsylvania as a research associate in the Babylonian collection. He rose to Clark Research Professor of Assyriology, a position he held until his retirement in 1968. But retirement, for Kramer, was a technicality. He continued working until his death at 93. When the University Museum celebrated his 90th birthday in 1987, with a public symposium titled History Begins at Sumer, nearly every leading Sumerologist in the world attended. The symposium was not just named after his most famous book, it was named after the idea that Kramer himself had proven, that the story of recorded human civilization begins with Sumer. Kramer's most widely known book was first published in 1956 under the title From the Tablets of Sumer. Later editions expanded its scope and renamed it History Begins at Sumer, documenting 39 firsts in its 3rd edition of 1981. The book introduced the general public to an idea that scholars had long known, but the wider world had not fully grasped: that an astonishing number of the institutions, practices, and literary forms we consider foundational to civilization appeared first in Sumer. The first schools, the first bicameral congress, the first case of tax reduction, the first legal precedent, the first pharmacopoeia, a medical text listing specific treatments and dosages, the first farmer's almanac, the first love song, a tender and explicit poem that predates the Song of Solomon by more than 1,000 years, the first library catalogue, the first literary debate, the first proverbs and moral sayings, and the first cosmological text, the first known attempt by any civilization to describe in writing how the universe began, where humanity came from, and what the relationship was between human beings and the forces that created them. But within the book and within the broader body of work from which it was drawn, there was a tension that Kramer himself acknowledged, but that most readers chose to overlook. The tension was this: the Sumerian cosmological texts do not describe a gradual development of civilization. They do not tell a story of trial and error, of innovations building incrementally on earlier innovations. Instead, they describe civilization arriving. They describe it being given. They name who gave it, and the names they gave were the Anunnaki. Now we arrive at the core of the matter. And I want to be very precise here, because precision is what distinguished Kramer from the sensationalists who would later borrow his work. Kramer was not a conspiracy theorist. He was a philologist, a scholar of language. His method was translation, not speculation. What he did for 70 years was read what the tablets said and report it as accurately as he could. So let us look at what the tablets said. The word Anunnaki appears across hundreds of Sumerian tablets. In the academic literature, it is most commonly translated as princely offspring, or seed of princes, though the precise etymology remains debated. In Sumerian belief, the Anunnaki were understood as the offspring of An, the supreme sky deity, and Ki, the earth goddess, though scholars note there is no confirmed etymological connection between the name Anunnaki and the god An specifically. An was the god of the heavens. The Anunnaki were the most powerful gods in the Sumerian pantheon. But here is what makes the Sumerian treatment of these figures so distinctive. The way the Sumerians described the Anunnaki was fundamentally different from the way later civilizations described their gods. The Anunnaki, as depicted in Sumerian tablets, are not abstract. They are not ethereal. They are not omnipotent. They eat. They sleep. They quarrel. They make mistakes. They hold meetings. They form committees. They delegate tasks. They grow tired of physical labor. They experience frustration. They negotiate. They compromise. They issue orders, and sometimes those orders are disobeyed. This is not what we typically call theology. There is nothing transcendent about the Anunnaki as the Sumerians described them. They are powerful, yes. They are long-lived, certainly. They possess knowledge and abilities that ordinary humans do not. But they are described consistently and without exception as physical beings operating in a physical world. Kramer drew attention to this distinction throughout his career. In his Sumerian mythology, published in 1944, and in The Sumerians, Their History, Culture and Character, published in 1963, he highlighted the remarkably concrete and practical nature of Sumerian religious texts. These are not poems of worship in the way that a Christian hymn is a poem of worship. They are closer to administrative reports. They describe events, they name participants, they record decisions. One of the most significant texts in the broader Mesopotamian literary corpus, and one that Kramer's work helped contextualize, is the Atrahasis epic, which exists in multiple versions across several tablets. The oldest known version dates to approximately 1700 years before the Common Era, though the narrative it contains is almost certainly much older. The Atrahasis text opens with a situation that is, by any literary standard, extraordinary. The great gods, the Anunnaki, have divided the cosmos among themselves. Anu has taken the heavens, Enlil has taken the earth, Enki, also known as Ea, has taken the waters. But there is a problem. The lesser gods, called the Agigi, have been assigned the hard labour of maintaining the world, digging canals, clearing waterways, managing irrigation, and they are exhausted. The text describes, in plain language, what reads like a labour dispute. The Agigi revolt. They burn their tools. They surround the house of Enlil in the middle of the night and demand relief. The Anunnaki convene a council. They discuss the problem. They consider solutions. And then Enki, the god of wisdom and water, proposes a radical answer. Create a new being. A being that can do the work the Agigi refuse to do. A being made from clay and from the blood of a slaughtered god. A lesser deity named Wela or Geshtue, depending on the version, whose intelligence will be mixed into the new creature so that it can understand and follow instructions. Consider the specificity of this proposal. It is not, let there be man. It is not a poetic act of divine will. It is an engineering specification. The raw materials are named clay and divine blood. The purpose is stated, labour. The quality control measure is identified. The creature must be intelligent enough to understand and follow instructions, which requires the admixture of a divine component. The production manager is assigned, the birth goddess Nintu. The process is described in steps. The goddess Nintu, also called Mami, also called Beletilis, is tasked with the actual creation. She mixes the clay with the divine blood. She shapes the figurines. After a gestation period described in the text, the first humans emerge. They are created, explicitly and without ambiguity, for the purpose of labour. The text says it plainly. Humanity is made to bear the toil of the gods. What strikes many readers of this text is its structure. The Atrahasis narrative does not read like a creation myth in the way that the first chapter of Genesis reads like a creation myth. Genesis describes a singular omnipotent God speaking the world into existence through divine command. The Atrahasis text describes a committee meeting. It describes a problem, a debate, a proposed solution, an implementation plan, and a result. This observation points toward a question that runs through Kramer's entire career. What kind of civilization writes about its own creation this way? To appreciate the material reality of the world the Sumerians built, let us turn to one of the most spectacular archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, one that unfolded just 2 years before Kramer began his own fieldwork in Iraq. In 1922, the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley began excavating the ancient city of Ur in a joint expedition funded by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania. Woolley would work at Ur for 12 seasons, until 1934, methodically peeling back layers of history stretching from the 4th century before the Common Era all the way to the city's prehistoric beginnings, around 4,000 years before the Common Era. But it was what Woolley found in the late 1920s that stunned the world. Beneath the ruins of Ur lay a cemetery, not a few scattered graves, a vast burial ground with approximately 2,000 individual interments spread over an area roughly 70 by 55 metres. Of these, Woolley identified 16 tombs that stood apart from the rest. He called them the Royal Tombs. They dated to roughly 2,600 years before the Common Era, the height of the early dynastic period. The richness of what he found inside rivaled the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, which Howard Carter had opened in Egypt just a few years earlier. Queen Puabi's tomb, identified by a cylinder seal bearing her name in cuneiform, was found intact. untouched by looters across 4.5 millennia. She lay on a wooden bier, wearing an elaborate headdress of gold leaves and gold ribbons, strands of lapis lazuli and carnelian beads, a tall comb of gold, chokers, necklaces, and a pair of large crescent-shaped earrings. Beside her were gold and silver cups, bowls of alabaster, cosmetic containers, and one of the world's earliest known musical instruments, a great lyre with a bull's head fashioned from gold and lapis lazuli. But it was not the gold that made the royal tombs of so haunting. It was the attendants. In the chambers and ramps leading to the royal burials, Woolley found the remains of dozens of people. Soldiers in copper helmets, women in elaborate headdresses, grooms standing beside the skeletons of oxen still yoked to their carts, musicians with their instruments. In one burial, designated PG-1237, which Woolley called the Great Death Pit, 74 bodies were found, mostly women, arranged in orderly rows wearing their finest garments and jewellery. They had gone willingly into the earth, or at least the arrangement of the bodies suggested no struggle. Each person appeared to have lain down in their assigned place and died, possibly by drinking poison, though the exact mechanism remains debated. The entire tableau suggests a civilization that believed, at the deepest possible level, that the relationship between the human and the divine was not metaphorical. It was operational. The king or queen served the gods in life. The retinue served the king or queen in life, and all of them would continue their service in whatever came after. Among the objects recovered from the royal cemetery were some of the most exquisite works of art the ancient world ever produced. The ram in a thicket, a statuette of a goat standing on its hind legs, reaching up into the branches of a flowering plant, was fashioned from gold, silver, lapis lazuli, copper, shell, red limestone, and bitumen. The Standard of Ur, a hollow box decorated with mosaic scenes on its two long sides, depicted on one face a banquet scene with musicians and revellers, and on the other a military victory complete with war chariots, infantry, and prisoners being led before the king. These were not crude images scratched into stone. They were masterworks of inlay, casting, and decorative arts, produced nearly 5,000 years ago by people who had access to materials from across the known world. The lapis lazuli came from the mines of Badakhshan, in what is now northeastern Afghanistan, more than 2,500 kilometres from Ur. The carnelian came from the Indus Valley. The gold and silver were imported from Anatolia or beyond. The fact that these materials were present in Ur at all is evidence of a vast organised, international trade network stretching across the ancient world, a network that someone had to design, maintain, and manage. Woolley's findings sent telegrams to London and Philadelphia, written in Latin so that news would not be intercepted and leaked to the press. The discoveries at Ur confirmed something that the cuneiform text had long suggested. The Sumerians were not a primitive people telling themselves comforting stories about gods in the sky. They were a sophisticated, wealthy, technologically advanced civilization that organised every aspect of its existence, from its economy to its architecture to its death rituals, around a relationship with beings they understood to be real, physical, and present. Now let's turn to Eridu. Eridu is the oldest city in Sumer. According to the Sumerian king list, a document that Kramer studied extensively throughout his career, Eridu is where kingship first descended from heaven. That phrase, descended from heaven, is not Kramer's interpretation. It is not a scholarly gloss. It is the literal translation of the Sumerian text. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Archaeological excavation confirmed the city's antiquity. Between 1946 and 1949, Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar, assisted by British archaeologist Seton Lloyd, excavated Eridu under the auspices of the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities and Heritage. They revealed a sequence of 17 superimposed temple levels, built one on top of another over a period of roughly 3,000 years, from approximately 5,400 years before the Common Era. Picture what that means. Imagine digging straight down through 3,000 years of continuous worship. Each layer you pass through represents a generation, a community that built its temple on the ruins of the one before, slightly larger, slightly grander, but always in the same spot, always oriented toward the same cardinal directions. The earliest temples are small and simple. As you dig upward through time, they grow. Columns appear, courtyards widen, offering tables multiply. The fish bones in the ash pits, the remains of ritual meals offered to whatever was worshipped here, never change. Fish, always fish. Enki, the god of the waters, the god of wisdom, the god who would one day warn a single human being to build a boat. His city, his temple, from the very first foundation stone to the last. The earliest identifiable temple structure, found at the deepest excavated levels, was small, barely more than a single room with an altar. But it was recognisably a temple. It was oriented toward the same cardinal directions as the later grander temples built above it. It contained the same types of offerings: fish bones, ash, the remains of ritual meals. This means that from the very beginning of occupation at Eridu, from the very first moment that human beings lived at this site, there was a temple. There was organised worship. The city grew around it. Most theories of social development hold that religious institutions emerge gradually, developing alongside other structures as communities grow. Eridu suggests something different. The temple came first. Everything else followed. The site itself sits in what is now a desolate stretch of southern Iraq, near the modern city of Nasiriyah. Today it is desert, a landscape of dust and heat shimmer, punctuated by the eroded mounds of tells that mark the locations of ancient cities. It is almost impossible to believe, standing there, that this was once a lush and fertile region, threaded with canals and rivers, green with date palms and barley. The Euphrates has shifted its course since the Sumerians lived here. The marshes that once made the south of Iraq a haven of biodiversity have been largely drained. What remains is silence and sand, and the faint outline of something enormous buried beneath the surface. And beneath those layers of temple and sand, in the archives of the museums that hold what Eridu yielded, there are tablets. Tablets that Kramer spent decades learning to read, but reading them was only part of the challenge, the greater challenge, the one that consumed years of his life and tens of thousands of miles of travel, was finding them. Because the tablets of Sumer were not waiting neatly in one place. They were scattered. When the University of Pennsylvania excavated Nippur in the 1880s and 1890s, the terms of the Ottoman-era antiquities agreements required that a portion of the finds be sent to the Imperial Ottoman Museum in Istanbul. Another portion went to Philadelphia. Later excavations divided their finds differently. Some tablets went to the British Museum, others to the Louvre, others to Berlin. A single literary text, a single poem, a single myth might exist on a tablet that had been broken in antiquity into 3 or 4 pieces, each piece ending up in a different museum on a different continent. Kramer understood, earlier and more clearly than most of his contemporaries, that the scattered fragments were not separate texts. They were parts of the same text, and the only way to reconstruct that text was to physically visit each museum, examine each fragment, compare the cuneiform signs line by line, and determine which pieces fit together. And so he travelled. In 1937, he went to Istanbul and spent months in the Museum of the Ancient Orient, copying Sumerian literary tablets that had been sitting in storage since the Ottoman period. He returned in 1946 and again in 1951. He went to the British Museum in London. He went to the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena, Germany, where the Hilprecht collection held fragments from Nippur. He went to the Louvre, he went back to Philadelphia, and at each stop he sat with a magnifying glass and a notebook, comparing the wedge-shaped marks on one fragment with the marks on another, looking for the telltale signs of a join, a place where the broken edge of one piece matched the broken edge of another, where the text on one continued seamlessly onto the other. This was not glamorous work. It was not the kind of archaeology that makes headlines. No golden tombs, no dramatic unveilings. It was the work of a man sitting in a basement with a lamp and a tablet the size of his palm, squinting at marks pressed into clay 4,000 years ago, trying to determine whether the sign in the lower left corner was a slightly damaged version of the sign in the upper right corner of a fragment he had seen 6 months earlier in a different country. But it was this work, this patient, meticulous, continent-spanning detective work, that made everything else possible. Without it, the descent of Inanna would still be a collection of unrelated fragments. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur would still be scattered across a dozen drawers in a dozen cities. The debate poems, the creation myths, the flood narratives, all of them existed physically as broken pieces in separate museums. Kramer was the one who put them back together. He once noted, with characteristic understatement, that a single Sumerian literary text might require him to travel to 4 museums in 3 countries, and that the process of reconstruction could take years. He did this not once, but dozens of times over the course of a career that spanned 6 decades. By the time he was finished, he had identified and published more Sumerian literary texts than any other scholar in history. He had, in a very literal sense, reassembled a civilization's library from its scattered remains. The Sumerian king list is one of the most studied and most puzzling documents in all of ancient Near Eastern scholarship. It exists in multiple versions, the most complete being the Weld Blundell prism, now housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. This small prism, roughly 8 inches tall with 4 inscribed sides, contains a chronological record of Sumerian kings, stretching from the earliest recorded times to the reign of Sin-Magir of the Izin dynasty, around 1800 years before the Common Era. The list is divided into 2 major sections: kings who ruled before the flood and kings who ruled after the flood. The post-flood section is largely accepted by historians as having some basis in historical reality. Many of the kings named have been confirmed through independent archaeological evidence. The pre-flood section is different, dramatically different. The antediluvian section lists 8 kings, who between them ruled for a total of 241,200 years. Individual reigns range from 18,600 years to 43,200 years. The reign durations are expressed in a numerical system based on units called sars, equal to 3,600 years, nears, equal to 600 years, and sosses, equal to 60 years. The academic response to these numbers has been, predictably, to dismiss them as symbolic or ceremonial. Some scholars have proposed formulas that yield more reasonable figures. Others suggest the numbers represent entire dynasties rather than individual rulers. Kramer's approach was more careful. He did not claim the pre-flood kings literally ruled for tens of thousands of years, but he refused to dismiss the numbers as meaningless. They are internally consistent. They follow mathematical patterns. The scribes who recorded them were clearly working within a system, and they intended the numbers to convey specific information. The 5 antediluvian cities named in the king list, Eridu, Bad-Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, are listed in a specific sequence that is consistent across multiple independent versions of the text, and the archaeological record confirms that several of these cities are among the oldest settlement sites in southern Mesopotamia. Excavations at Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah, one of the very sites where Kramer himself worked in 1930, revealed a layer of waterborne sediment that some archaeologists interpret as evidence of a significant flood event, dated to approximately 2,900 years before the Common Era. The Sumerians organized their entire understanding of history around that flood. Before it, the world was governed directly by the Anunnaki and their appointed kings. After it, governance was transferred to human dynasties. The flood was the dividing line between the world as it once was and the world as it had become. One of Kramer's most celebrated achievements was his translation of the Sumerian poem known as the Descent of Inanna. This text, reconstructed from numerous cuneiform tablet fragments scattered across museums in Philadelphia, Istanbul, and London, tells the story of the goddess Inanna and her journey into the underworld. Kramer first published a partial version in 1937. Over the next 50 years, he continued to discover and incorporate additional fragments. His final collaborative version, produced with folklorist Diane Walkstein and published in 1983 under the title Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth, remains one of the most widely read translations of Sumerian literature. The poem begins with one of the most famous openings in all ancient literature. From the great above she opened her ear to the great below. Inanna decides to descend into the underworld, the realm of her sister Ereshkigal. Before she leaves, she gives precise instructions to her servant Ninshuba. If Inanna does not return within 3 days, Ninshuba is to go to the temples of the gods and plead for help. The descent itself is structured around 7 gates. At each gate, Inanna is required to surrender one of her adornments: her crown, her necklace, her breastplate, her golden ring, her measuring rod, her garments. By the time she passes through the 7th gate, she is naked and powerless. She enters the throne room of Ereshkigal, where the Anunnaki, here described as the judges of the dead, pass judgment against her. Ereshkigal strikes her dead and her corpse is hung on a hook. Imagine the descent. You are a goddess, the most powerful female figure in the Sumerian pantheon, queen of heaven, mistress of love and war, and you are walking downward through a stone corridor that grows darker with every step. At the first gate, the gatekeeper stops you. He has been told to expect you. He tells you to remove your crown, the shugura, the crown of the step. You protest. He says it is the way of the underworld. You remove it. At the second gate, your small lapis lazuli measuring rod is taken. At the third, the double strand of beads around your neck. At the fourth, the breastplate called Come Man Come. At the fifth, the gold ring on your wrist. At the sixth, the lapis measuring rod and line. At the seventh, the royal robe that covers your body. You're stripped of everything that makes you who you are. Your authority, your beauty, your identity. You enter the underworld as nothing, and nothing is what you become. This is not a metaphor that the Sumerians buried inside their text. It is the text. The poem enumerates each item, names each gate, records each exchange between Inanna and the gatekeeper. The level of procedural specificity is extraordinary. It reads the way a customs inspection reads, a systematic cataloguing of what was carried in and what was surrendered. What is significant from a scholarly perspective is the text structure. The gates are numbered, the items surrendered at each gate are itemized, the duration of the journey is specified, the instructions given to Ninshubur are detailed and procedural. The text reads not as a religious poem or a mythological allegory, but as a report, a travel record, a bureaucratic account of a journey through a system with rules, checkpoints, and documented procedures. Some scholars argue that this level of procedural detail simply reflects the Sumerian scribal tradition's preference for enumeration and systematic description. Others suggest it points to something deeper, an institutional memory embedded in literary form. Kramer let the texts speak for themselves, noting their distinctive qualities without prescribing a single interpretation. Another text central to Kramer's body of work is the composition known as Enki and Ninmah. This tablet describes the creation of human beings, but with a twist that sets it apart from other ancient creation narratives. In this text, Enki and Ninmah, the birth goddess, are at a feast. They have been drinking. In a state of intoxication, they begin a creative competition. Ninmah shapes various human forms from clay, and Enki assigns each one a role in society. But some of the forms are defective. One cannot walk, another cannot see, another is sexually ambiguous. For each, Enki finds a purpose, a place in the social order. The creation of human beings in this text is not presented as a single, perfected act. It is presented as an iterative process, an experiment with multiple prototypes, some successful and some not. The goddess makes something. The god evaluates it. Adjustments are made. The process continues. Kramer insisted that the text be read on its own terms, as an account of deliberate, purposeful creation through a process of design, testing, and refinement. This is fundamentally different from a creation story in which a single, all-powerful deity speaks the world into existence through sheer will. The Sumerian account describes creation as a project, a collaborative, messy, imperfect project carried out by beings who are powerful but not omnipotent. Every culture has a flood story. But Kramer pointed out something easily overlooked. The Sumerian flood narrative is the oldest known flood story in written form. It predates the biblical account in Genesis by at least 1,000 years. The question of influence runs in one direction. The Sumerian flood story exists in multiple versions. The oldest Sumerian text is the Eridu Genesis, preserved on a single tablet from Nippur, dated to approximately 1,600 years before the Common Era. The more detailed Akkadian version is found in the Atrahasis epic and in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The structure is consistent across all versions. A great flood is coming. One god, typically Enki, breaks ranks with the rest of the divine assembly and warns a single human being. The warning is specific. Build a boat, seal it with bitumen, load it with your family and with animals. The flood comes. It lasts 7 days and 7 nights. The waters recede. The survivor makes a sacrifice. The gods, who had been starving because there were no humans left to bring them offerings, descend on the sacrifice, gathering, in one of the most vivid images in ancient literature, like flies over the offering. Let that image settle for a moment. These are the gods, the Anunnaki, the beings who created humanity, who established civilization, who divided the cosmos among themselves. and they are described as descending on a burnt offering like flies, hungry, desperate, diminished by the very catastrophe they had decreed. This is not the language of reverence. This is not the language of worship. It is the language of observation, of someone watching powerful beings behave in ways that are uncomfortably familiar. The gods are not above hunger. They are not above regret. They are not above need. The version preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, the account given by Utnapishtim to the wandering king, adds details that heighten the realism. The storm that brings the flood is so terrifying that the gods themselves cower. They retreat to the highest heaven and crouch against the wall like dogs. The goddess Ishtar, who had initially supported the decision to destroy humanity, weeps and cries out, "How could I have spoken evil in the assembly of the gods? How could I have ordered battle to destroy my people?" The description of the flood itself is visceral. The waters rise, the dikes break, the darkness is total, and the land was shattered like a pot. When the waters finally recede and the survivor opens a hatch in the roof of his boat, he sees nothing. A flat expanse of water in every direction. Silence. He releases a dove. It returns. There is nowhere to land. He releases a swallow. It returns. He releases a raven. It does not return. Land has been found. The aftermath is especially telling. The gods argue among themselves. Enlil is furious that Enki disobeyed the order to destroy humanity. Enki argues that total destruction was a mistake, that the gods need humanity. A compromise is reached. The birth goddess will arrange that some pregnancies fail, that certain priestesses remain celibate, and that human lifespans will be limited. The gods institute biological controls on human population, not through magic, but through reproductive regulation. The structure is not the structure of a legend. Legends create heroes. They dramatize courage and endurance. The Sumerian account describes something different, a rescue operation. The warning is logistical. The preparation is practical. The survival is a matter of engineering. The aftermath is a policy negotiation. And the gods, throughout the entire episode, behave not like omniscient cosmic powers, but like managers who have made a decision they now regret and are scrambling to deal with the consequences. There is a Sumerian text that Kramer studied and compared with the biblical Tower of Babel narrative, a text that tells us how the Sumerians themselves understood the invention of their greatest achievement, writing. The poem is called Enmerkar and the Lord of Aratta. It was composed during the Neo-Sumerian period, around the 21st century before the Common Era, and it tells the story of a conflict between Enmerkar, the legendary king of Uruk, and the unnamed king of Aratta, a distant, wealthy city believed to lie somewhere beyond the mountains, perhaps in what is now Iran or Armenia. Enmerkar wants the riches of Aratta, its gold, its silver, its lapis lazuli, to embellish the temples of Uruk. He sends a messenger across the mountains with increasingly elaborate demands. The Lord of Aratta responds with riddles and counter-challenges. Back and forth the messenger travels, carrying longer and more complex messages, diplomatic threats wrapped in poetic self-aggrandizement. And then something happens. The messages become too long and too complicated for the messenger to remember. He cannot reproduce them accurately. Imagine this man, dusty, exhausted, standing before the king of Uruk after yet another journey across the mountains, trying to recite from memory a message that is part diplomatic threat, part ritual invocation, part personal boast, part riddle, and failing. The words tangle, the sequence blurs, and both kings know that the integrity of their negotiation depends on the exact wording of what is said. And so Enmerkar does something that no one, according to this text, had ever done before. He takes a lump of clay and presses words into it. The Sumerian text says it plainly. Because the messenger's mouth was heavy and he couldn't repeat the message, the Lord of Kalaba patted some clay and put words on it, like a tablet. Until then, there had been no putting words on clay. Think about what is being described here. The invention of writing, arguably the single most important technological development in the history of human civilization, is presented not as a divine gift, not as a bolt of inspiration from the gods, but as a practical solution to a logistical problem. A messenger cannot remember a message, so a king invents a way to store language outside the human brain. It is an act of engineering, not of theology. and it is described with the same matter-of-fact problem-solution structure that characterizes so much of Sumerian narrative. The Lord of Arata receives the tablet, examines it, and understands the message, which has led scholars to debate whether some form of symbolic communication existed on other materials before Enmakar's innovation. The Sumerians, it seems, credited the invention of writing on clay to a specific king, in a specific situation, for a specific practical purpose: diplomatic communication over long distances. But there is something else embedded in this text. Near its beginning, the poem describes a golden age, a time before conflict, before dangerous animals, before the confusion of languages, when there was no snake, when there was no scorpion, when there was no hyena, when there was no lion. Man had no rival. And in this paradise all people spoke a single tongue. This passage, as Kramer recognized, bears a striking resemblance to the biblical account of the Tower of Babel, a connection he noted and documented, adding it to his growing catalogue of biblical motifs with Sumerian antecedents. No discussion of the Sumerian account of how civilization was established would be complete without addressing the concept of the Emi, one of the most distinctive and puzzling elements of the entire Sumerian worldview. The Mi, pronounced roughly like May, are described in the tablets as a set of divine decrees or cosmic laws that govern every aspect of civilized life. They include not just moral principles or religious rituals, but practical skills and social institutions, kingship, priesthood, truth, the descent into the underworld, sexual intercourse, the art of the scribe, the art of the musician, the art of the woodworker, the art of the coppersmith, the art of the leather worker, the art of the builder, the art of the basket weaver. They include abstract concepts like wisdom, attention, and the troubled heart. They include specific social roles: the court official, the temple administrator, the military commander. In the Sumerian poem known as Inanna and Enki, which Kramer translated and published, the goddess Inanna visits the god Enki in his city of Eridu, and through a combination of charm and trickery, persuades him to give her the Mi. The text lists over 100 individual Mi that Inanna takes with her. Enki, realizing what he has done, sends his servants to retrieve them, but Inanna escapes and brings the Mi to her own city of Uruk, where they establish the foundation for that city's greatness. The Mi are not presented as human inventions. They are divine property, designed, maintained, and distributed by the gods. A city that possesses the Mi flourishes, a city that loses them declines. The closest modern analogy might be software. The Mi are the operating system of civilization, and in the Sumerian account they were not written by human beings, they were written by the gods. One of the most consequential aspects of Kramer's work was his demonstration that many narratives in the Hebrew Bible had clear Sumerian antecedents. The flood narrative is the most obvious example. The structural parallels between the Sumerian flood story and the Book of Genesis are exact, and the direction of influence is unambiguous. But the flood was only the beginning. Kramer traced the biblical concept of a primordial paradise to the Sumerian description of Dilmun, a land where there was no sickness, no old age, no predation, and no conflict. He traced the creation from clay to the Sumerian texts, in which Enki and Ninmah fashion human beings from clay, mixed with divine substance. He traced the rivalry between Cain and Abel to Sumerian debate poetry between sheep and grain, a literary form in which two figures argue before a divine judge about which is more valuable. He traced the biblical concept of divine law, the commandments delivered from heaven, to the Sumerian Mi. He traced the motif of the confusion of languages to the Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata text we have already discussed. He traced the concept of a Job figure, a righteous sufferer who questions divine justice, to a Sumerian poem he titled Man and His God, which predates the Book of Job by more than a millennium. Every one of these parallels points in the same direction. The literary and theological traditions of the Hebrew Bible did not emerge in a vacuum. They emerge from a cultural matrix with its deepest roots in Sumer, and in Sumer, those traditions were not presented as theology, they were presented as history. Among the texts that Kramer pieced together from scattered fragments is one he titled Man and His God, a Sumerian poem he recognized as the earliest known treatment of a question that has haunted human beings for as long as they have been able to ask it. Why do the righteous suffer? The poem, approximately 135 lines long, was reconstructed from 5 tablets and fragments. Kramer published his analysis in 1955, noting that it predated the biblical Book of Job by more than 1,000 years. In the poem, An unnamed man, once wealthy, wise, and respected, is struck by illness and misfortune. His friends turn against him, his enemies mock him, his body fails, and he cannot understand why. He has been faithful, he has performed his duties, he has praised his God, and yet suffering has found him. The man weeps, he laments. He describes his condition in language that is raw and immediate, the pain of his body, the abandonment by those he trusted, the bitter taste of a life that has turned against him for no reason he can discern. And then he does something that separates this text from the later book of Job. He confesses. He acknowledges that no human being is without sin. Never has a sinless child been born to its mother, the text says. The implication is that suffering may be the natural condition of imperfect creatures, that the question is not, why do I suffer, but what should I do about it? The answer the poem offers is prayer, persistence, and humility. The man continues to glorify his God, and in the end his God hears him, turns a favourable ear, and delivers him from his afflictions. Kramer noted something important about this text. It is not theology in the abstract. It is a human being, recorded on clay more than 3,000 years ago, grappling with the same question that the author of Job would grapple with, that the Buddha would grapple with, that every hospital chaplain and every grieving parent has grappled with since. The Sumerians did not simply record the deeds of gods. They recorded the experience of being human in a world governed by gods, the confusion, the pain, the desperate need to believe that the suffering means something. This is the texture of Sumerian literature that gets lost when we focus only on the Anunnaki and the creation myths. The tablets contain philosophy, they contain psychology, they contain the full range of human emotional experience pressed into clay by people who are trying, just as we are trying, to make sense of a world that often refuses to make sense, and they contain humour. The Sumerians invented the literary debate, a genre in which two personified entities argue their relative merits before a divine judge. Kramer documented 7 known debate topics from Sumerian literature. Summer argues against winter, bird argues against fish, the hoe argues against the plough, the date palm argues against the tamarisk, silver argues against copper. And in perhaps the most famous of these debates, the one Kramer highlighted for its parallel to the biblical story of Cain and Abel, sheep argues against grain. The debate between sheep and grain opens with a creation scene. The Anunnaki gods exist, but they do not yet know the names of sheep or grain. They eat grass with their mouths and drink water from ditches, like the primitive humans they will later create. Then sheep and grain are created on the holy mountain and sent down to earth, where humanity benefits from both. But at a divine banquet, after the beer has been flowing, the two begin to quarrel. Sheep boasts of her wool, her milk, her lambs. Grain counters with her bread, her beer, her indispensability to human survival. The argument escalates. Insults are exchanged. And in the end, the god Enlil renders judgment. Grain is the winner. Because, as scholar Jeremy Black has noted, the poem implies that a human being can survive without domestic animals, but cannot survive without bread. These debate poems were not casual entertainment. They were a standard part of the curriculum in the Sumerian scribal school, the Aduba. Students copied them as exercises. By the time of the third dynasty of Ur, roughly 2100 to 2000 years before the Common Era, they were performed at the royal court. Records survive indicating that payments were made to the performers who took part. What the debates reveal, beyond their literary charm, is a culture that valued argument, evidence, and formal adjudication, even in its entertainment. The structure of the debates mirrors the structure of the Sumerian legal system. 2 parties present their cases, a judge evaluates the evidence, and a verdict is rendered. It also mirrors, and this is the point that matters for our story, the structure of the divine assembly itself, the Anunnaki debate. They present arguments, they render judgments. The literary form and the cosmological form are the same. And this is the observation that runs through every corner of Kramer's work. In Sumer, the human and the divine were not separate categories. They were the same system, operating at different scales. Let us now consider what mainstream archaeology tells us about the emergence of Sumerian civilization, independent of any interpretation of the Anunnaki texts. Southern Mesopotamia is not a promising place for the birth of a great civilization. It is flat, riverine, and alluvial. It has no significant mineral resources. It has no forest for timber. It has very little stone. The raw materials necessary for monumental construction, metallurgy, and long-distance trade are almost entirely absent. And yet, beginning around 3,500 years before the Common Era, Sumerian civilization produced an extraordinary catalogue of innovations. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, irrigation engineering, legal codification, organized religion, centralized government, professional specialization, international trade, urban planning, the potter's wheel, the wagon wheel, the plough, the sailboat, the arch, the vault, the dome. These appeared with remarkable speed, particularly during the transition from the Ubaid period to the Uruk period, a transformation that archaeologists have studied extensively but never fully explained. The acceleration that occurred during the Uruk expansion, roughly 3,800 to 3,100 years before the Common Era, remains one of the most striking cultural transformations in the ancient world. Uruk, at its height, may have been the largest city on Earth, with a population estimated at 40 to 80,000 people. This is what historians sometimes call the Sumerian question, originally referring to the puzzle of the Sumerians' mysterious linguistic and ethnic origins, but extending naturally to the broader question of how such a sophisticated civilization emerged so rapidly in a region with so few natural advantages. Various explanations have been proposed: migration from an unknown homeland, influence from an unidentified precursor culture, convergent development driven by the unique pressures of riverine agriculture. Each has some merit. None fully accounts for the speed and scope of what happened. And it is not only the speed that puzzles, it is the reach. The Sumerians were trading with civilizations thousands of miles away. They had a word for the Indus Valley civilization, they called it Meluha, and they imported carnelian beads, ivory, and exotic woods from the Indian subcontinent through an intermediary they called Dilmun. Dilmun is a fascinating case in its own right. In Sumerian mythology, Dilmun was the paradise, the land where the sun rises, where there is no sickness, no old age, no death, where the lion does not kill and the wolf does not snatch the lamb. Kramer translated these descriptions carefully and noted their resemblance to the biblical concept of Eden. But Dilmun was also a real place. Archaeological evidence identifies it with the island of Bahrain and portions of the eastern Arabian coastline, where Ubaid and later Sumerian-era trading posts have been excavated. Stamp seals, pottery and cuneiform tablets found at Bahrain confirm that Dilmun functioned as a major commercial hub, a way station in the trade routes connecting Mesopotamia with the Indus Valley. What is striking is the overlap between the mythological and the commercial. The Sumerians described Dilmun as both a paradise of the gods and a trading partner from which goods arrived by ship. This merging of the sacred and the practical, this refusal to separate divine geography from economic geography, is characteristic of the Sumerian worldview. For them, the gods did not live in some abstract spiritual realm beyond the sky. They lived in places with real coordinates on real trade routes. The Sumerians themselves had an answer to how their civilization arose. They said it was given to them. They named the givers, they described the giving in detail, they recorded it on clay. There is another dimension of Sumerian civilization that illustrates how deeply the Anunnaki were integrated into every aspect of daily life, not as distant, abstract deities, but as active participants in the functioning of society. The Sumerian temple was not simply a place of worship. It was the economic, administrative, and political center of the city. The temple owned land. It employed workers. It managed irrigation. It stored grain. It distributed rations. It recorded transactions. It collected taxes. In many Sumerian cities, the temple functioned as a redistribution center, a centralized institution that collected the surplus product of the city's labor and distributed it according to need, status, and obligation. And the temple was understood to be the literal house of the god, not a symbolic house, the literal residence of a specific deity who was believed to physically inhabit the structure, to eat the food offerings placed before the cult statue, to wear the garments draped upon it. The most dramatic ritual was the sacred marriage, the Eros Gamos, a ceremony in which the king united with the goddess Inanna through a physical act with a high priestess who served as the goddess's earthly representative. This was not metaphorical. It was performed annually, and it was recorded in explicit detail. Kramer was among the first to fully translate and publish the Sumerian sacred marriage texts. He noted that the descriptions are remarkably frank and physical. They describe the goddess preparing herself for the encounter, perfuming her body, adorning herself with jewels. They describe the union in language that is simultaneously erotic and ceremonial. They describe the aftermath, blessings bestowed upon the land, fertility restored, abundance guaranteed. The Sumerians did not perform the sacred marriage as an act of imagination. They performed it because they believed, at every level of society, that the gods were present, that the gods had physical needs, that the relationship between gods and humans was practical, reciprocal, and concrete. Before we continue, I want to do something that most discussions of the Anunnaki fail to do. I want to talk about the things we inherited from Sumer that we use every single day. Things we take so completely for granted that we have forgotten where they came from. You checked the time today. The hour you read was divided into 60 minutes, each minute into 60 seconds. That division, 60, not 10, not 12, comes directly from the Sumerian sexagesimal system, developed more than 5,000 years ago. It was passed from Sumer to Babylon, from Babylon to Greece, from Greece to Rome, from Rome to the medieval world, and from there to the clock on your wall. You have never asked yourself why there are 60 minutes in an hour. The answer is, because the Sumerians decided there would be, and no civilization since has seen fit to change it. The same system governs the measurement of angles. A circle has 360 degrees. Each degree has 60 minutes of arc. Every GPS satellite, every navigation chart, every flight path is calculated using a framework invented by scribes who pressed reed styluses into wet clay. The Sumerians chose 60 as their base because it is extraordinarily divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20 and 30. No repeating decimals, no awkward remainders. It was a brilliant choice, suggesting mathematical sophistication far beyond what we might expect from people we're told were simply the earliest farmers to organize themselves into cities. They developed the first known system of writing. They built the first known cities, Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Lagash, urban centres, with populations in the tens of thousands, with planned streets, centralised temples, marketplaces, administrative districts. They developed the first known legal codes, the Code of Ur-Nammu, dated to approximately 2100 years before the Common Era, predating the Code of Hammurabi by 3 centuries. They developed the first known schools, the Aduba, or tablet houses. We know about these schools in detail because the students' practice tablets survived. Some contain a teacher's model text on one side and the student's attempt on the other. Some contain corrections. One contains a Sumerian schoolboy grumbling about being punished by his teacher and asking his father to invite the teacher to dinner and offer him a gift. They developed irrigation engineering, astronomical observations, and a calendar precise enough to predict celestial events. Let us linger on the astronomy for a moment, because it deserves more attention than it usually receives. The Sumerians, and the Babylonians who inherited their astronomical traditions, track the movements of the moon, the sun, and the 5 visible planets with a precision that would not be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. They divided the sky into constellations. They identified the ecliptic, the path the sun appears to trace across the sky over the course of a year. They recognized the 12 zodiacal constellations that lie along that path. They calculated the length of the lunar month to within a fraction of a second of the modern value. They developed mathematical methods for predicting lunar eclipses. The zodiac we use today, Aries, Taurus, Gemini and the rest, descends directly from the Babylonian zodiac, which in turn descends from Sumerian astronomical traditions. When an astrologer in the 21st century speaks of the Age of Aquarius, they are using a framework whose roots reach back to cuneiform tablets, inscribed in southern Mesopotamia thousands of years ago. How did a civilization with no telescopes, no precision instruments, no glass lenses, a civilization working with nothing more than naked eye observations and reed-marked clay, achieve this level of astronomical precision? The conventional answer is time, patient observation over many centuries, combined with meticulous record-keeping, allowed cumulative refinement, and that is undoubtedly part of the story. But the speed with which Sumerian astronomical knowledge appears to have developed during the Uruk and early dynastic periods, the same periods that saw the explosive growth of writing, mathematics, and urban architecture, raises the same question that haunts every aspect of the Sumerian anomaly. Every single one of these innovations, writing, agriculture, law, astronomy, architecture, is attributed in the Sumerian textual tradition to the wisdom of the gods, brought down from heaven and bestowed upon humanity. Kramer documented this attribution in meticulous detail. It is not a vague claim, it is specific, repeated and consistent across thousands of texts. Among the oldest wisdom texts in human history is a Sumerian composition known as the Instructions of Shuruppak. Kramer knew this text well. It purports to be the advice of Shuruppak, the last antediluvian king, father of the flood hero Ziusudra, to his son on the eve of the Great Deluge. The earliest known copies of this text date to roughly 2600 years before the Common Era, making it one of the oldest pieces of literature that can be attributed even loosely to a named author. The instructions themselves are practical, earthy, and surprisingly modern in their sensibility. Do not buy a donkey that brays too much. Do not guarantee another man's debt. Do not build your house on the public square. Do not speak arrogantly to your mother. Do not pass judgment when you are drinking beer. What makes the instructions of Shuruppak relevant here is not its content, charming as it is, but its framing. The text places its wisdom in the mouth of a figure from before the flood, from that antediluvian world described in the king list, when kings ruled for impossible spans of years and civilization was new. It presents practical knowledge, how to live, how to avoid trouble, how to treat others, as something passed down from a deeper, older time, a time when things were known that had since been partially forgotten. This is a thread that runs through all of Sumerian literature, and Kramer traced it carefully. The pervasive sense, expressed across hundreds of texts, that the Sumerians understood themselves to be the inheritors, not the inventors, of their civilization. That the knowledge they possessed had come from somewhere else, from someone else, from a time that was already ancient when the first cuneiform scribe pressed a reed into clay. This inheritance anxiety, this awareness of possessing knowledge whose origins predated the possessor, manifests throughout Sumerian literature in ways both grand and intimate. The king lists look backward. The creation texts look backward. The flood narratives look backward. Even the school exercises look backward. Students copying ancient texts they did not fully understand, preserving literary forms whose original context had been lost, maintaining a tradition whose beginnings were already shrouded in the kind of distance that cannot be measured in years alone. It is as if the entire civilization were a library, not a library that was building its collection, but a library that was desperately trying not to lose one. Any honest account of Kramer's legacy must address the Zechariah Sitchin question, because it is here that the story becomes complicated in ways the academic world has used to dismiss the conversation entirely. Zechariah Sitchin, born in Baku in what is now Azerbaijan, published The 12th Planet in 1976. He proposed that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings from a planet beyond Neptune called Nibiru. He argued that the Sumerians recorded these beings' arrival, their genetic engineering of humanity, and their eventual departure. Sitchin explicitly built his arguments on Kramer's translations, and his books became enormously popular. Based on what is known of Kramer's scholarly temperament and published methodology, he would almost certainly have found Sitchin's planetary hypothesis to be an extrapolation far beyond what the texts support. The planetary hypothesis, the identification of Nibiru, the extraterrestrial framework, these go well beyond the textual evidence. But, and this is the distinction that matters, the content of the tablets themselves is not in dispute among qualified scholars. The tablets describe the Anunnaki as powerful beings associated with the heavens. The tablets describe the creation of humanity as a deliberate act. The tablets describe a flood known in advance. These are not Sitchin's inventions. These are the standard scholarly translations. Translations that Kramer did more than anyone to establish. The tragedy of the Sitchin episode is that it gave the academic world a convenient excuse to dismiss the entire subject. If Sitchin says something, and Sitchin is wrong, then everything he talked about must be wrong. This is a logical fallacy, but it is an effective one, and it has been used for 5 decades to avoid engaging with what the tablets themselves actually say. Why has the broader world not engaged with what Kramer's translations reveal? The answer is not a conspiracy. It is simpler than that, and more difficult to fix. The first reason is structural. Academic careers are built on consensus. A young Assyriologist who publishes a paper arguing that the Sumerian texts should be read as literal accounts of contact with non-human intelligences will not be published in a peer-reviewed journal. They will not receive tenure. They will not receive grants. This is not a written rule. It is an unwritten one, enforced not by overt punishment but by exclusion. Kramer could let his translations speak for themselves because his career was behind him. His reputation was unassailable. Most scholars cannot afford such freedom. The second reason is methodological. Mainstream scholars have well-developed frameworks for understanding ancient religious texts. Comparative mythology, literary analysis, structural anthropology. From within these frameworks, the Sumerian texts are mythology. Sophisticated, distinctive mythology, but mythology nonetheless. The procedural tone that strikes some readers as evidence of something beyond myth is interpreted by most scholars as a reflection of Sumerian scribal convention. This is a legitimate scholarly position, and it would be dishonest not to acknowledge it. The third reason is deeper. If the tablets are read at face value, this is not merely a historical question, it is an existential one. Religious institutions depend on the idea that human beings were created by a transcendent God for a spiritual purpose. The Sumerian account describes creation as a labour management solution. Scientific institutions depend on the model of gradual evolution through natural selection. A deliberate creation event carried out by technologically advanced beings does not fit within that model. And there is a fourth reason, perhaps the most human of all: the sheer discomfort of not knowing. The modern world likes answers. It likes categories. It likes clear boundaries between fact and fiction, science and religion, history and myth. The Sumerian texts refuse to be categorized. They are too specific to be dismissed as fairy tales. They are too strange to be accepted as history. They sit in a space that our intellectual frameworks have no name for, a space where the administrative and the extraordinary coexist, where the procedural and the mythological occupy the same clay tablet, the same line, the same word. That space is uncomfortable, and when human beings encounter something uncomfortable, their first instinct is not to investigate, it is to look away. No single institution wants to be the first to reopen these questions. Let us not leave the impression that the Sumerian tablets contain only cosmological puzzles. They also contain the full texture of a lived human civilization. Kramer was the first to identify the oldest known love poem in human history, a Sumerian text in which a bride addresses her beloved in language both passionate and explicit. He published it with a mixture of scholarly precision and evident delight. He also published the oldest known medical text, a Sumerian tablet from Nippur, dated to approximately 2600 years before the Common Era, listing 15 pharmaceutical recipes. The prescriptions include detailed instructions for preparing poultices and ointments from plant, animal, and mineral ingredients. Kramer noted that the text contains no prayers, no incantations, no appeals to divine intervention. It is a practical, secular medical document, the oldest such document ever found. He identified the first literary debate, a text in which two figures argue the relative merits of summer and winter, or sheep and grain. He identified the first written legal precedent, a case involving a conspiracy to commit homicide, in which the Assembly of Nippur distinguished between those who planned the killing and those who merely knew about it, a legal distinction Western systems would not formally codify for thousands of years. All of this is to say, the Sumerians were not a mythological people living in a mythological world. They were a real civilization with real institutions, real problems, and real solutions. Their records are not fairy tales. They are the administrative, legal, literary, and scientific archive of a society that functioned at a level of sophistication that still surprises scholars today. And when that same society recorded the story of how their civilization began, they said it was given to them by beings called the Anunnaki. If we trust their love poems and their medical texts and their legal records and their mathematical tables, on what basis do we dismiss their account of their own origins? Kramer did not work in isolation. Thorkilde Jacobsen, the Danish-American scholar at the Oriental Institute and later at Harvard, produced foundational studies of the Sumerian king list and the political institutions of ancient Mesopotamia. His interpretation of the Sumerian Divine Assembly as a prototype of democratic governance placed the Anunnaki Council meetings in a political context that reinforced the observation that these texts read more like administrative records than theological poetry. Jacobsen said of Kramer that his contribution was so basic that the field may be said to have been completely transformed, almost created by him. Benno Landsberger, a German Assyriologist also at the University of Chicago, contributed crucial work on Sumerian lexicography, the study of word meanings and usage across thousands of texts. His cataloguing of vocabulary helped establish the precise semantic range of key terms used to describe the Anunnaki and their activities. Åke Shuruppak, a Swedish scholar who succeeded Kramer as Clark Research Professor and curator of the tablet collection at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, continued the work of translating and publishing the Nippur tablets. Under his direction, the conservation and cataloguing of the collection ensured that thousands of texts would survive long enough to be read. Every new text that was translated confirmed the same basic picture. The Anunnaki were consistently portrayed in physical, concrete terms. Humanity was consistently described as a created species. The flood was consistently presented as a known event managed by competing divine authorities. The origin of civilization was consistently attributed to divine instruction. This was not the conclusion of a single eccentric scholar. It was the consistent reading by every qualified translator who worked on the texts. The disagreement was not about what the tablets said. The disagreement was about what to do with what they said. I want to address directly the skeptic who has been patient enough to listen this long. The person who is thinking, these are just old stories. Every culture has creation myths. Here is what is distinctive about the Sumerian record. The Greek creation myths, the theogony of Hesiod, the Prometheus story, were composed by known authors for known literary purposes. They are self-consciously literary. The Egyptian creation myths were associated with specific priesthoods and temple complexes. They were institutional documents. The Hindu creation accounts are philosophical and speculative, asking questions about existence and offering tentative, self-questioning answers. The Sumerian creation texts are different from all of these. They are not literary in the way that Hesiod is literary. They are not institutional propaganda in the way that Egyptian temple texts are. They are not philosophical in the way that the Vedic hymns are. They are administrative, bureaucratic, procedural. They read like records. Consider the contrast. When a Greek poet described the birth of Athena, springing fully armed from the head of Zeus, no one in the audience was expected to take this as a literal account of a medical procedure. It was poetry. It was metaphor. It was art. The Greek tradition knew the difference between myth and history, even if the boundary was sometimes blurred. But the Sumerians wrote their creation accounts in the same style, the same format, and with the same level of institutional detail that they used for everything else. The same scribal schools that trained students to copy hymns to the Anunnaki also trained them to copy grain inventories, legal contracts, and mathematical tables. The same clay, the same reed stylus, the same cuneiform signs. There was no separate mythology department producing texts in a different register. The creation accounts sat alongside the administrative records in the same temple archives, written by the same scribes, in the same hand. You can classify them as mythology if you wish, and most scholars do, with well-reasoned arguments. But the question remains, why does a civilization that kept meticulous records of grain shipments, irrigation schedules, legal proceedings, and trade agreements adopt this same procedural administrative tone when describing the most important events in its own history? The Sumerians were the most meticulous record keepers the world had ever seen, and those meticulous record keepers said, plainly and repeatedly, that their civilization was established by beings called the Anunnaki. You can choose not to take them at their word, but you should at least understand what you are choosing to set aside. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves exploration, and it concerns the question of time. The pre-flood rain lengths in the king list are expressed in sars, niers, and sosses, units of 3,600, 600, and 60, respectively. Some researchers have proposed that these numbers represent astronomical cycles rather than human lifetimes, precession of the equinoxes, orbital periods, or calendrical cycles encoded in the base 60 system. Others suggest the units of measurement changed over time, and that a year in the pre-flood section does not correspond to a solar year. None of these explanations is fully satisfactory, but all agree on one point. The scribes were working with a mathematical system of considerable sophistication, and they intended the numbers to be meaningful. Either the king list is a reliable document, or it is not. If it is not, then we must also question the post-flood sections that historians use to construct the chronology of early Mesopotamian history. If it is, then we must grapple with what the pre-flood sections are trying to tell us. The Sumerians believed in a world before the flood. This was not a casual belief. It was a foundational element of their historical consciousness. Every version of the king list that includes the antediluvian section begins with the statement that kingship descended from heaven and was established in specific cities. These 5 cities, Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, are named as the antediluvian capitals, and they are listed in a consistent sequence across multiple independent versions of the text. Before the flood, the world was governed directly by the Anunnaki and their appointed kings. After the flood, governance was transferred to human dynasties, and the Anunnaki receded from direct involvement in earthly affairs. This structure, a golden age of divine rule followed by a catastrophe, followed by a diminished age of human rule, is found in multiple ancient traditions. The Greeks had their succession of ages: gold, silver, bronze, iron, each one worse than the last. The Hindu tradition describes a cycle of yugas, from the perfect Satya Yuga to the degraded Kali Yuga. The Norse had their account of the gods' withdrawal from the affairs of mortals. Whether these widespread parallels reflect independent cultural responses to the human condition, a shared ancestral memory of real events, or some combination of both, is a question that lies beyond the scope of any single scholarly discipline. What the Sumerians said in their own terms was that the world had once been different, that powerful beings had once been present who were no longer present, that the knowledge those beings had brought was now slowly being lost, and that the flood was the dividing line between the world as it once was and the world as it had become. There is something deeply human in this belief, this sense of living in a diminished world, of being the inheritors of something greater than what we have now managed to preserve. It echoes in every culture that tells stories of a golden age. It echoes in every old person who says that things were better before. It echoes in the quiet suspicion felt by anyone who has stood before something truly ancient, a ruined temple, a worn inscription, a weathered stone, that those who came before us knew things we have forgotten. The Sumerians felt this. They wrote it down, and they did so with the same careful, methodical, administrative attention that they brought to everything else: their grain tallies, their legal records, their school exercises, their love songs. They were not a people given to exaggeration or fantasy. They were the most practical civilization the world had yet produced, and their practicality is precisely what makes their cosmological claims so unsettling. Meanwhile, the events described in the tablets, whatever their actual nature, were understood by the Sumerians to be extremely old even by their own ancient standards. We are looking at records that are 5,000 years old, describing events that the record keepers themselves believe to be many thousands of years older. The depth of time is staggering, and it is precisely this depth that makes the consistency of the record so remarkable. The same basic account, Anunnaki, creation, flood, civilization, appears across thousands of tablets, written by hundreds of scribes over a span of more than 1,000 years of literary production. It is not a fringe idea within the Sumerian tradition. It is the tradition. And these scribes, sitting in the temple schools of Nippur, copying out the creation texts, the king lists, the hymns, the flood narratives, they were not recording recent events. They were recording what was, even to them, ancient history, stories from before the flood, stories from before the beginning of the world as they knew it. When a scribe in 2100 years before the Common Era copied out the Atrahasis epic, he was already looking backward across a gulf of time that he could not precisely measure. He was preserving something old, something his teachers had taught him, and their teachers before them, stretching back into a past that was already wrapped in silence. No other ancient civilization produced anything quite like it. The Egyptians had their cosmologies, but they varied dramatically from city to city, priesthood to priesthood. The Greeks had their myths, but they were the work of individual poets, each reshaping the tradition to suit their own artistic vision. The Sumerians had a consensus, not a unanimity. There are variations, contradictions, regional differences, but a consensus, a shared framework that persisted across centuries, across city-states, across the entire span of Sumerian literary history. That consensus said, we were made, we were given knowledge, we were meant to serve, and the beings who made us are no longer here. There is a building in Philadelphia, the Penn Museum, that houses nearly 30,000 cuneiform tablets, most from the excavations at Nippur. The The British Museum in London holds approximately 130,000, the largest collection in the world. The Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, the Louvre in Paris, the Istanbul Archaeological Museums, the Yale Babylonian Collection, all hold significant collections. The total number of excavated cuneiform tablets in museums worldwide is estimated at around 500,000. The number that have been fully translated and published is perhaps 100,000, possibly less. This means the vast majority of the oldest written records in human history are unread, not lost, not destroyed, unread, sitting in museum basements, labelled and catalogued, but never translated. There are only a few hundred qualified cuneiformists in the world. Funding for ancient Near Eastern studies has never been generous. A single tablet can take days or weeks to fully translate. Kramer understood this problem as well as anyone alive. He spent his career racing against time, not the time of his own life, but the time of institutional attention. In the years since Kramer's death, a new tool has emerged. In 2023, a team of archaeologists and computer scientists from Israel, including computer scientist Guy Guthers and archaeologist Shai Gordon of Oriel University, published a groundbreaking paper in the peer-reviewed journal PNAS Nexus, describing a neural machine translation model capable of translating Akkadian cuneiform directly into English. Their system achieved a blue 4 score of around 37, not yet matching expert human translators, but far higher than many expected for a first-generation model. The implications are significant. If AI translation can be brought to a level of reliability sufficient for initial survey work, flagging interesting texts for human scholars to review, then the pace of translation could increase by orders of magnitude. Tablets that would otherwise sit untranslated for decades could be processed in months. As of the mid-2020s, this technology is still maturing. Formal Akkadian texts, royal decrees, omens, administrative records translate well because they follow predictable patterns. Literary texts are more challenging, and the AI is prone to hallucinations. Generated translations bearing no relationship to the actual text. Sumerian, with its isolate grammar, remains significantly harder to process than Akkadian, but the trajectory is clear, and a single example illustrates what awaits. A cuneiform tablet first highlighted by Kramer. It appeared on the dust jacket of his 1956 book, but never fully translated during his lifetime, was recently deciphered by University of Chicago Sumerologist Jana Matusak. The study was published in the academic journal Iraq. The tablet, designated NI 12501, originally found during 19th century excavations at Nippur and dating to approximately 2400 years before the Common Era, had sat in museum records for more than a century. When Kramer first published an image of the tablet, he omitted its museum number, only revealing it in a separate publication years later. Its fragmentary nature and the difficulty of its early Sumerian script discouraged comprehensive analysis for generations. When finally read, it revealed an entirely unknown Sumerian myth. In the story, the storm god Ishkur is trapped in the netherworld, causing drought and devastation on Earth. Enlil, king of the gods, summons a divine assembly, the Anunnaki, to rescue his son. But among all the deities present, only Fox, a trickster figure, steps forward. Fox enters the underworld and is offered food and drink, a potentially deadly trap, for eating the food of the dead would prevent his return. But Fox is clever. He accepts the offerings but hides them rather than consuming them. The tablet breaks off before the resolution. This is the earliest known narrative in all of human literature featuring a cunning fox as a hero, predating Aesop by more than 2,000 years. It is the only known myth in which the Sumerian storm god Ishkur plays the central role, and it sat in a museum drawer known but unread for more than 100 years. One tablet, one previously unknown myth. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of unread tablets, and you begin to grasp the scale of what remains unknown. It is important to be clear about what Kramer did not say, because the space between what he actually documented and what has been attributed to him by enthusiasts, by conspiracy theorists, by popular authors, is significant. Kramer did not say that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials. He did not use the word alien. He did not propose a planetary origin for these beings. These are claims made by others who built upon his translations, but went far beyond what he was willing to state. What Kramer did, consistently and with extraordinary scholarly rigour, was translate the texts faithfully and draw attention to what made them distinctive. He noted their procedural tone. He noted the administrative detail. He noted the attribution of civilization's institutions to divine instruction. He made these observations visible. He published them. He left the interpretation to the reader. That is what Kramer did. It is enough. It does not need to be inflated with alien spacecraft or hidden planets. The plain reading of the tablets, as translated by the greatest Sumerologist who ever lived, is extraordinary enough on its own. To understand why the Sumerian texts read the way they do, it helps to understand how the Sumerians understood their cosmos. The universe was divided into several realms: An, the heaven, ruled by the god Anu; Ki, the earth, eventually associated with Enlil; the Abzu, the deep freshwater ocean beneath the earth, the domain of Enki; and Kur, a complicated term that could mean mountain, foreign land, or underworld. The Anunnaki occupied specific positions within this structure. They were not floating, omnipresent spirits. They were administrators, each assigned to a jurisdiction, each responsible for specific functions. Enki managed the waters, the arts of civilization, and the creation of humanity. Enlil governed the earth, the winds, and the destinies of nations. Inanna presided over love, war, and political power. Utu administered justice. Nanna measured time. Below the Anunnaki were the Igigi, the lesser gods who originally did the physical labour before humanity's creation. Below the Igigi were the human beings, created to work, to serve, and to provide sustenance to the gods through offerings. This hierarchical structure is described with the specificity of a government organisational chart. Each god has a title. Each god has a domain. Each god reports to a superior. Decisions are made by committee. Authority is delegated. Disputes are adjudicated. Kramer noted repeatedly that this level of institutional specificity is distinctive. The Greek gods are far more individualistic and far less bureaucratic. The Egyptian gods, while complex, are more symbolic. The Sumerian gods are administrators. They run things. They manage. Whether this reflects a culture projecting its own administrative sophistication onto its deities, the most parsimonious explanation, or something else, something remembered rather than imagined, is a question that Kramer's translations force upon every serious reader. Before we close, let me return to a text I mentioned earlier, the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, because in many ways it captures something essential about who the Sumerians were and how they understood their relationship with the divine. When the Elamites invaded and destroyed the city of Ur around 2004 years before the Common Era, bringing the glorious Third Dynasty to its end, the Sumerians did not simply record the military defeat. They wrote a poem, 436 lines long, divided into 11 sections, that is one of the most emotionally powerful compositions in the entire ancient world. The poem is voiced primarily through the goddess Ningal, the wife of the moon god Nanna, patron of Ur. She describes how she pleaded with the divine assembly, with Anu and Enlil, to spare her city. She wept before them. She begged, and they denied her. The destruction of Ur was not random misfortune. It was a divine decree voted upon by the assembly of the gods, and it could not be reversed. And so the poem describes the aftermath. The streets empty, the temples abandoned, the people scattered. Alas, the destroyed city, my destroyed house, Ningal cries again and again, in a refrain that echoes across the centuries. What makes this text so striking is its combination of overwhelming grief and absolute institutional precision. The poem names which gods abandoned which cities. It describes the specific sanctuaries that were left vacant. It records the divine council's deliberation as a procedural event. Even in their deepest sorrow, the Sumerians wrote like bureaucrats. Even in their most raw emotional expression, they maintained the administrative framework that characterized all their interactions with the divine. Scholars have noted that the biblical Book of Lamentations, composed more than 1400 years later, bewailing the destruction of Jerusalem, shares striking structural and thematic parallels with the Sumerian city laments. Both personify the city as a grieving woman. Both describe divine abandonment. Both record the silencing of musicians and the desolation of sacred spaces. The tradition of lamentation literature, it seems, travelled the same path as the flood narrative, from Sumer to the Hebrew world. Kramer assembled this poem in 1940 from 22 separate tablet fragments, scattered across multiple institutions. It was one of his earliest major publications, and it remained, by his own account, one of the works closest to his heart. There is something about this poem that speaks across the millennia. You do not need to be a scholar of Sumer to feel it. You do not need to read cuneiform or understand Emessal, the special dialect in which the goddess speaks. You only need to have loved a place that no longer exists, a neighbourhood that was torn down, a house that was sold, a school that closed, a town that emptied. The voice of Ningal, weeping for her city, pleading with gods who have already made up their minds, is the voice of anyone who has ever watched something they loved disappear and been unable to stop it. And the poem knows this. It was written to be performed, to be sung aloud in temples, to be heard by communities still reeling from the loss. It was not entertainment. It was therapy, the kind of therapy that only art can provide. The Sumerians understood something that we are still learning, that grief must be spoken to be survived, that loss must be given form to be endured, and that the act of remembering, even when what is remembered is pain, is itself a kind of salvation. 4,000 years after the fall of Ur, the poem still works. The city is still gone. The goddess is still weeping. And anyone who listens, really listens, can still hear her. In the final decade of Kramer's life, the 1980s, he was still active, still publishing, still engaged. His collaboration with Diane Walkstein on Inanna, Queen of Heaven and Earth in 1983 brought Sumerian literature to a new generation of readers. His autobiography, In the World of Sumer, published in 1988, provided a personal account of his career, his discoveries, and his frustrations. In that autobiography, Kramer was more candid than he had been in his earlier academic publications. He spoke about the institutional pressures that shaped how ancient texts were categorized. He expressed deep frustration about the vast backlog of untranslated tablets. As his colleague Dr. Orka Sjöberg recalled, Kramer continued working almost to the last moment. What emerges from his late career is a scholar who believed above all that the texts deserved to be read on their own terms, not filtered through modern assumptions, not softened for institutional comfort, not dismissed as just mythology, without first reckoning with the extraordinary specificity and consistency of what they describe. He did not ask his readers to believe, he asked them to read, and he trusted that, if they read carefully enough, they would arrive at the same uncomfortable recognition he had, that the oldest written records in human history say something that the modern world has not yet figured out how to process. One significant development since Kramer's death offers both hope and frustration. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, CDLI, was launched in the late 1990s as a collaborative effort to digitize cuneiform tablets from collections worldwide. Based at the University of California, Los Angeles, the project has created a searchable database, including records for hundreds of thousands of individual artifacts. Scholars can now search for specific texts, compare tablet fragments across collections, and identify joins, cases where pieces of a single original tablet ended up in different museums, without physically travelling from city to city as Kramer had to do. But digitization is not translation. The photographs exist, the cuneiform signs can be seen, but the meaning remains locked behind a barrier of expertise that only a few hundred living human beings can penetrate. This is where the AI translation projects become so significant. If machine learning can be applied to cuneiform at scale, even imperfectly, flagging texts of interest for human review, then the backlog could begin to clear within a generation. But could is not will. The technology exists. The tablets exist. What does not yet exist is the institutional commitment to bring the two together. Institutional commitment requires someone in a position of authority to say that these tablets matter, that what they contain is important enough to fund, to prioritize, and to read. No one in such a position has yet said this. And so, the tablets wait. In climate-controlled rooms, in acid-free storage, in metal drawers with careful labels, waiting for a world that has the technology to read them, the resources to fund the reading, and the courage to take seriously what they say. There is a specific quality to the Sumerian tablets that I want to convey, because it is the quality that Kramer spent his life trying to communicate. These are old objects, not old in the way that a medieval cathedral is old, or a Roman ruin is old. Older than all of these, the tablets Kramer read were inscribed 2,000 years before Christ, 2,000 years before the Parthenon, 1,000 years before the earliest books of the Hebrew Bible. When the first Sumerian scribes pressed their reeds into clay, the Great Pyramid of Giza had not yet been built. Stonehenge was still under construction. The Indus Valley civilization was in its infancy, and those scribes were not recording recent events. They were recording events that, even in their time, were understood to have happened long ago. The antediluvian kings, the council meetings of the Anunnaki, the creation of humanity. These were, for the scribes, old stories. Stories from before the flood. Stories from before the beginning of the world as they knew it. The same basic account, Anunnaki, creation, flood, civilization, appears across thousands of tablets, written by hundreds of scribes, over a span of more than 1,000 years of literary production. It is not a fringe idea within the Sumerian tradition. It is the tradition. There are moments in the study of history when you encounter a fact so large and so plain that it seems impossible anyone could overlook it. The fact is this: the oldest literate civilization in recorded history left behind a comprehensive, detailed, internally consistent account of its own origins. That account says that civilization was not invented by human beings. It was given to them by beings who were powerful, physical, long-lived, and non-human. Beings who created humanity for a specific purpose, established cities and institutions, managed the world through a hierarchical administration, and eventually withdrew. This account exists in the physical record. It is inscribed on clay. It has been translated by the most qualified scholars in the world. Samuel Noah Kramer spent 70 years making it readable. He reported what it said. He made the translations available. He let the texts speak for themselves. The tablets are still there, in the same museums, in the same storage rooms, in Philadelphia, where Kramer spent his life, in London, in Berlin, in Paris, and in Istanbul, the city that sits at the crossroads of continents, where Kramer himself travelled multiple times to copy tablets that had been shipped from Nippur during the Ottoman era. Every one of those tablets is still saying the same thing it said 5,000 years ago. The cuneiform has not faded. The clay has not crumbled. The words have not changed. There is something that happens when you spend a long time with old things. Not old in the human sense, not a grandmother's quilt or a father's watch, but old in the civilizational sense. Objects that were made before the civilization you belong to existed, before the language you speak was spoken, before the religion you were raised in was conceived. You begin to feel the weight of continuity, the sense that the human story is much longer, much stranger, and much less understood than the tidy narrative we tell ourselves in schools and textbooks. You begin to suspect that there are chapters missing, not lost, not burned in some ancient library fire, but simply unread, sitting in drawers, waiting. And you begin to wonder what it says about us, about the kind of civilization we have become, that we possess 500,000 clay documents from the very beginning of human literacy, and we have read fewer than 1/5 of them, that the oldest written words ever pressed into clay by human hands are sitting in metal drawers in climate-controlled rooms, beneath fluorescent lights, in cities where millions of people walk past every day without knowing they are there. What does it say about a civilization that it possesses the oldest records of its own origin and cannot be bothered to read them? Perhaps it says that we are afraid, not of what we might find, though that is part of it, but of what it might cost us. Every institution in modern society, religious, scientific, academic, governmental, has built itself upon a particular understanding of how human history works. The chronological model we teach in schools, Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, Classical Antiquity, the Middle Ages, the Modern Era. This model is the foundation on which thousands of careers have been built. Entire museum collections are organised around it. Textbooks are written according to it. Funding agencies allocate resources based on it. If the Sumerian account introduces even the possibility that civilization was not developed independently by human beings, but was given, or at least catalysed, by an external intelligence, then the entire edifice needs to be re-examined, not necessarily discarded, but re-examined. And institutions do not re-examine their foundations willingly. But here is another way to think about it. If the Sumerian accounts are mythology, if they are the imaginative creations of a brilliant but ultimately pre-scientific people, then they are still remarkable. They are still the oldest sustained literary effort in human history. they still reveal a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and depth. They still deserve to be read, studied and understood. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, memories, metaphors or something else entirely, the Sumerians wrote about them with a specificity and a seriousness that commands attention. And if the accounts are something more than mythology, if they contain, encoded in their administrative language and procedural structure, some trace of events that actually occurred, then the implications extend far beyond the boundaries of any single academic field. They touch the deepest questions any civilization can ask. Where did we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone? These are the questions that keep people awake at night, and paradoxically, they are also the questions that can carry you gently into sleep. Because they are the questions that have no end, the questions that open into silence, the questions that the mind can hold without needing to resolve. Samuel Noah Kramer felt this weight every day of his working life. Philadelphia, November 1990. A man sits in a room surrounded by the work of a lifetime. He is 93 years old. His throat is failing. His voice, the voice that explained to packed auditoriums how the Sumerians had invented everything from schools to love poetry, 1,000 years before anyone else thought to try, that voice is nearly gone. Around him are the books, 30 of them, 250 articles. Behind every page, behind every footnote, there are the tablets, the small, dense rectangles of baked earth that he first touched with his own hands in the dust of southern Iraq in 1930. He made the texts available. He published them in his books, his lectures, his articles. He put them before colleagues who nodded politely and classified them as mythology. He put them before students who listened with wide eyes and then built careers in safer corners of the discipline. He put them before the public through popular books translated into a dozen languages. When a scribe in the ancient city of Nippur pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and recorded in precise and deliberate strokes the story of how the Anunnaki convened a council, how they decided to create a workforce from clay and divine blood, how they gave humanity the tools of civilization, that scribe was recording what he understood to be the truth about the origin of his world. And his record has outlasted every empire, every language, every institution, and every certainty that has existed between his time and ours. Kramer heard the tablets. He listened for 70 years, and he made it possible for the rest of us to hear them too. He was not asking anyone to believe. He was asking them to read, to look at the evidence, to take the oldest written records in human history as seriously as we take every other form of evidence that the Sumerians produced, to extend to their cosmological accounts the same respect we extend to their mathematical tables, their legal codes, their agricultural manuals and their medical prescriptions. Not to accept their claims uncritically, but to engage with them honestly, to ask what it means that the most methodical civilization in the ancient world described its own origins in terms that the modern world cannot comfortably categorize. That is the question Kramer left behind. It is not a question of belief. It is not, do you believe the Anunnaki were real? That framing misses the point entirely. The question is simpler and more uncomfortable. What does it mean that the oldest civilization in recorded history described its own origins this way, consistently, across thousands of texts, with no indication that it considered these descriptions to be metaphorical? We have never seriously asked that question, not as an academic community, not as a civilization. We have classified the answer as mythology, filed it under religion, and moved on. But the tablets have not moved on. They are patient. They have outlasted the Sumerian civilization that produced them. They have outlasted the Akkadian Empire that conquered them. They have outlasted Babylon and Assyria and Persia and Greece and Rome. They have outlasted the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire and every other structure of power that has claimed dominion over the land where they were first pressed into clay. They have survived fires and floods and wars and looting and neglect and 5,000 years of forgetting. Clay does not hurry. Clay does not forget. Rest now. The tablets have not finished speaking. There are hundreds of thousands of them, sitting in drawers and display cases, waiting for the next pair of hands careful enough to hold them, the next pair of eyes trained enough to read them, the next voice brave enough to say what they say. The tablets have waited this long. They can wait until morning. If this story stayed with you, if it gave you something to think about as you close your eyes, a like helps more than you know. It tells us to keep going, to keep making these. And if you want to keep listening, there is a playlist waiting. More stories like this one, more ancient places, More questions that do not have easy answers. Let it play. Let it carry you. If you have thoughts, if something in this story sparked a question, or a memory, or a connection you want to share, the comments are open. We read them, all of them. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well and dream deep. Good night.